I done did some shit that you ain't never did. I done saw some shit that you ain't never seen. I done been some places you ain't never been. I done did some shit that you ain't never did. Saw some shit that you ain't never seen. Been some places you ain't never been. Sip, drink, you don't never lean. Four nigga with a 30 clip, big Glock 9 with a red beam. I done been broke, I done had money, I done had shoot, I was another team. I done did some shit that you ain't never did. Saw some shit that you ain't never seen. Been some places you ain't never been. Sip, drink, you don't never lean. Four nigga with a 30 clip, big Glock 9 with a red beam. I done been broke, I done had money, I done had shoot, I was another team. I done did some shit that you ain't never did. Saw some shit that you ain't saw before. Spurred a nigga in the job before. Took off running from the law before. I was selling OG by the dollar store. Used to get that Reggie from Hilario. That was middle school, like in 6th grade. I would cut the Philly with a switchblade. I knew I was destined for a big play. I knew I was destined for a mixtape. I been kicking flavors since the talent show. Had a fully loaded automatic flow. What's a fully loaded automatic flow? When I spit the verses like a calico. Watch me spit the verse like a calico. Run and let your mama and your daddy know. Shots. I am something to run and tell about. They thought I was smoking airplane gas cause I'm jumping fly in the helicopter. 800 for the Louis Shades up in North Park just to look smart. Money caller with the T-top on the lawn horse and the push start. I done did some shit that you ain't never did. Saw some shit that you ain't never seen. Been some places you ain't never been. Sip, drink, you don't never lean. Four nigga with a 30 clip, big Glock 9 with a red beam. I done been broke, I done had money, I done had shoot, I was the other team. I done did some shit that you ain't never did. Saw some shit that you ain't never seen. Been some places you ain't never been. Sip, drink, you don't never lean. Four nigga with a 30 clip, big Glock 9 with a red beam. I done been broke, I done had money, I done had shoot, I was the other team.
Really fuck, nigga. No man, give it up, nigga. Shot it out, let it bust, hit him. Did it all for a check killer. I was broke, I was sick, digging licks in the brick with a stick. Have a split, serving nicks to a zip. Take a drill, 30 big boys in a big clip. Out of town, serving at the quick trip. Ain't no hoe, ain't no hoe. This fofo, gon' blow. My grind big, you a small joke. I'm still into that mud. That wet dirt, give a fuck. I did the most in these damn streets. Having news in these back streets. Ain't no nigga real like me. Hard time made a stiff G. Serving 80s just to eat. Mama called it cause the work cheap. Sucker niggas wanna murk me. Had to get it, had to go see. Let these niggas know it ain't peace. I'm a damn fool if you want this.
I done did some shit that you ain't never did. Saw some shit that you ain't never seen. Been some places you ain't never been. Sip, drink, you don't never lean. Four nigga with a 30 clip, big Glock 9 with a red beam. I done been broke, I done had money, I done had shoot, I was the other team. I done did some shit that you ain't never did. Saw some shit that you ain't never seen. Been some places you ain't never been. Sip, drink, you don't never lean. Four nigga with a 30 clip, big Glock 9 with a red beam. I done been broke, I done had money, I done had shoot, I was the other team.
We Japanese still. You getting cooked in front of your family? Like a Japanese meal. It's y'all soup the hibachi and none of you niggas can stop me. But can't help but watch me. Look, man, it's gonna be a sub-Saharan type of month, man. Happy Black History Month. So another episode in the books. We're on our third video today. I'm gonna knock out a few more tomorrow. With that being said, the topic is going to be domesticated animals and how they prove ancient Eurasian migrations into sub-Saharan Africa. We've been going in hard about this pretty much all week, and I've just been digging into the archives and sharing with you guys the information that I've been blessed, to have my hands on. So, that being stated, we're going to get right into it. We ain't going to waste no time, man. Ain't nothing to it but to do it. So let's get this one knocked out too. So this is the book Mobile Technologies and the Ancient Sahara, right? And we're going to be on page 278. Page 278 of Mobile Technologies of the Ancient Sahara. And within this book, let me blow this up. Let you guys see the title real quick. The title page, that's how the book looks. Edited by C.N. Duckworth. All right. And this book is very interesting. It talks about the Garamantes, it talks about the Phoenicians. It talks about how, again, it's in the name, mobile technologies, how the ancient Sahara and Western Africa and other sub-Saharan African portions get their hands on certain technologies like glass making, pyrotechnology, iron metallurgy, animal husbandry, so on and so forth. Today we're going to be dealing with the animal side of things because it's very interesting when you look at it. Because in order for a group to have domesticated animals, they would have to be familiar with that breed, and they have to know how to actually tame and rear those breeds. So that's usually an indicator that that person or that group is familiar or grew up around them or was in an area or a zone that had that knowledge and skill for those particular animal breeds. All right. So with that being said, let's get right into it. Movement and management of animals in North and West of Africa from 1000 BC to 1000 AD. 1000 BC part is a very integral part of history. 3,000 years ago, that's when we started seeing a lot of these movements of peoples. That's when you see the Bantu expansion going through the equatorial force, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of things going on. Fulani are getting their components during that time. There's other certain West African movements, North African movements, all going on 3,000 years ago. You start seeing the clay begin to rapidly radiate of E1B1B in North Africa during this time. So a lot of things going on during this 1000 BC period. It says there are several possible paths of introduction for domestic species brought into North and West Africa. For the early phases, 6 to the first millennium BC, the dominant idea is that the translocation of most domestic animals and many domestic plants originated from the Levant. So that's what the book says. They originated from the Levant, with most species entering Africa first through modern Egypt. I mean, if you have any basic understanding of geography, then you know why that has to be the case. If you go into the Levantine corridor, of course you're going to pass or enter into Egypt. These species are then thought to have been moved in a general east to west direction, traveling along routes which then branched southward. So again, they start off in the Levant, come down through Egypt, and they go in a west direction and then go down southward. It says either the Central Saharan route through Fezzan to Lake Chad or eastern Niger Bend regions, or south from Morocco to Senegal through Mauritania, or across to the western Niger Bend. All of this makes sense. All of this makes sense, man. When you look at this all makes sense because we're seeing these genetic components come in at the same time. We're seeing these Eurasian components during the Holocene and afterwards dump into North Africa and dump into sub-Saharan Africa. As we just saw and as we just read, we're seeing the direction of these animals coming from the Levant, going through North Africa, going westward, and then south, making their way to Nigeria, Lake Chad, so on and so forth. The earliest agricultural economies presumably reached large parts of coastal northern Africa by sea. Although as far as animal bones are concerned, there is very little actual archaeological evidence for these early stages. Later on, domestic animal species, possibly the chicken, may also have been introduced through a Mediterranean route, perhaps transported by Phoenician trade networks and moved southward, oasis by oasis. So the Phoenicians could have been integral in introducing chickens to north and then southwestern Africa. In addition, from the first millennium AD, domesticated animal species were also spread in the east to west direction along the Sahel zone, starting from the Horn of Africa and reaching sub-Saharan West Africa in this way. It is possible that the route itself impacted dissemination of some species. For example, sites in Burkina Faso have chickens, but not camels, present in early levels. Senegalese sites have camels or equids, but not chickens. Although the archaeological evidence could be purely coincidental, these early introductory narratives sometimes also consider packages or combinations of species moving together into the Sahara, such as cattle, caprines, and possibly dogs, which arrived first in Egypt from the Levant and then spread gradually, reaching the western and eventually southern regions of the African continent. Again, in order to have these domesticated animals, you need people with the know-how from the region that the animals are from. So if they're coming, if the animals are coming from the Levant, there are people coming from the Levant, right? It's just a very simple logical deduction. It says in sub-Saharan West Africa, archaeological data for periods preceding the arrival of the first animal domesticates in the second half of the third millennium BC are limited. Animals were moving in the company of people, but there is little material evidence for technology transfer and interaction with local communities. So again, these animals require people. It requires demographic movements. It's just that simple, at least in the early stages. It is probable that multiple repeated translocations of the same domestic species occurred across North and West Africa. Some of these were probably unsuccessful in the sense that they did not lead to the establishment of local breeding populations of the animals concerned. This option is not often considered and is difficult to detect archaeologically. However, osteometric data in sub-Saharan Africa highlights the existence of different types of the same species, which may represent separate introduction events. Although the archaeological evidence seems to generally support these paths of introduction, the narratives are often inherently colonial in nature, and there are some issues of interpretation. First, there is a bias towards the excavation of large urban sites along the North African coastlines, with Greek, Phoenician, and Punic colonies frequently the target of research. Second, domestication is ongoing coevolutionary process rather than an event or invention. The fact that a domestic species originated outside of Africa and is then charted at sites across the landscape in order of its earliest appearance in a region does not accurately reflect the continued adaptation of the species and the impact of local management strategies over time. For example, the genetic history of domestic cattle in Africa is immensely complex, but a review of the evidence concludes that the Y chromosome haplotype diversity in African cattle breeds is directly indicative of deliberate long-term efforts of pastoralists to enhance their herds. Furthermore, some of this diversity is likely to be the result of genetic contributions from wild male African Eurasian. Previous synthetic research on North African faunal material is limited. Anthony King's review of mammal bones from sites across the Roman world was the first to present a regional view of the evidence from sites in North Africa. This was a groundbreaking and vital piece of work, but North Africa was not his primary focus, and interpretations were limited by period and species. Leon and Mattingly focused solely on North Africa and contextualized the role of domestic species within the rural landscapes and agricultural practices of the late antique, Vandal, and Arab periods, roughly the 3rd to 8th centuries AD. But the role of the faunal data in this piece was relatively minor. More synthetic papers exist on sub-Saharan West Africa, and a large amount of West African faunal data have been synthesized by one of us. This chapter is unique in its geographical approach, presenting faunal data for domestic animals across the Sahara, as well as adjacent regions, both north and south of it, with the aim of studying relations and connections between these areas. We will discuss the species translocation and then proceed to the biological requirements, husbandry, movements, roles, and archaeological evidence of key species. As we know, what we're seeing here, animal husbandry, all has its origin in the Levant, makes its way through Egypt, then goes to North Africa, and that's what these regions you see down here south on the map here. That's what this map is detailing. Right, and you can see it's in Western Africa, it's in the northern regions of the Sahel as well. As we can see, these animals make their way, traveling from the north, coming down to the south. All right. It says maps of sites discussed along with generalized distribution of Kabyline rock art. The rock art is important because the people are pretty much document. That's an ancient document, so to speak, of the animals that they had encountered, right? Or the animals that they domesticated. The translocation of species. Again, how do you translocate species? You need people to do that, right? You need people. These are domesticated breeds. The introduction of domestic species to new areas requires human-driven relocation of animals to unfamiliar environments. So we have a lot of animals that have Y chromosomes and DNA from the Levant. It required people in that region to translocate them and bring them into sub-Saharan Africa, to bring them into North Africa. They needed people, right? Otherwise, they'd be wild. This is a very simple, easy argument to understand. This is direct evidence of Levantine-related peoples coming into Africa, coming into sub-Saharan Africa. As we read in the beginning, in the onset of this chapter, they start in the Levant, go through Egypt, go westward, and then go south. It says a veritable host of terminological nomenclature exists to describe this idea, ranging from characterizing it as an activity to the process or product, and the usage of terms varies substantially across and even within disciplines. For this chapter, we have chosen to use the broadest general definition of translocation as a change of location, substitution of the conservation biology term introduction is not appropriate as it does not capture the process of movement and transportation, and is by definition focused on the establishment of a species in a specific habitat. Although the term translocation defined as the deliberate and mediated movement of organisms from any source, captive or wild, from one area to free release in another by International Union of Conservation Standards. Animals are not often released as a matter of course through the process with which we are concerned, and the framework of conservation is not fully suitable for studying the past movements of domestic species. Additionally, although the process and risk of translocation are fully applicable to domestic species, much of the literature on animal translocation is limited to wild species. This is probably due in part to research priorities, which are driven by concerns for the survival of endangered species and at-risk habitats. The movement of domestic species is thus subsumed by the movement of humans. You can't have domestic species without humans. Humans have to domesticate the species. It's a very, very simple argument. Very, very simple line of reasoning. Despite issues of clear relevance and common, such as stress, disease, and environmental requirements, and two archaeologically framed papers in which the concept of translocation is explicitly considered, the author discussed the human-aided movement of domesticates and commensal species, and then either focus on species viewed as exotic rarities or go on to state they are concerned only with non-domesticated animals. Other contributions take the arrival of species in a new area as the main investigative focus and do not fully consider the process and the requisite animal management skills and technology. Because you got to have that. Like, how do you have these animals? You don't have the skills of husbandry. You don't have the technology necessary to keep these animals, right? Especially in foreign environments where you kind of have to artificially mold the environment to suffice the needs of that breed, right? So again, this is all indicative, like we just read here, of people moving with these animals at the onset of the introduction of these animals to these new areas. Again, coming from the Levant through Egypt, westward through the north, and then south, right? And that matches our yap carriers. We see a lot of yap carriers in these regions. Again, we've already covered this week that EM2 was in the Green Sahara, was in North Africa at the onset, and then made its way down and moved, right? Moved southwards and northwards as well. It says, of moving these creatures across long distances, the sheer economic cost, technological challenge, and potential risks presented by the translocation of domestic species in the ancient world at any scale is surely worth further consideration. to say nothing of the ways in which past human life ways and activities would have been altered by the arrival of novel species. Domestic species have widely varying life and health requirements, and their needs, both behavioral and biological, would have substantially affected the methods used to transport them. Animals with higher water requirements would be by necessity have to stop more frequently and perhaps travel across less direct routes with more available water. Specialized knowledge and skills would have played no small part in moving animals across past landscapes and quite possibly also in managing them upon arrival in unfamiliar environments. You need people with the know-how to do this. With regard of the translocation of species across North and West Africa, transportation mechanisms of various sorts could have been utilized. In terms of cross-country movement, some animals can be herded or led by tether, possibly with the assistance of dogs. This is likely to have been the case for camels, cattle, caprines, and equids. And others, chickens, could have been packed onto the backs of transport animals or into carts or other vehicles. It is possible that horses in particular accompanied a chariot into North Africa. Pigs are a bit more problematic with regard to land-based movement. They require frequent watering. Their foraging habits make them unsuitable for herding over long distances, and they would have lost valuable weight during the transit. Land-based translocation of pigs may thus have required specialized skills and a substantial amount of time and effort to achieve, particularly in the Sahara. Maritime transport is a plausible alternative for moving pigs and could certainly have played a role in the movement of other domestic species along the coasts of North and West Africa. In the case of West Africa, arrivals of domesticates by sea probably continued as late as the 16th century AD. There are notable ecological and biological considerations which must be taken into account when investigating the range of impacts which might have occurred as a result of domestic species translocation. The success of translocated species in any environment is innately tied to disease vulnerability and exposure. It is possible that camel populations were not established in certain parts of North Africa and most of West Africa due to their vulnerability to fly-borne ailments of humid climes, including trypanosomiasis. Camels can also face health difficulties if they are not provided with enough salt or access to halophytic plants, as salt deficiency can lead to necrosis of skin and cramps. Some West African breeds of cattle, sheep, and goats are trypanotolerant, resistant to trypanosomiasis, possibly a locally developed adaptation. Trypanotolerance appears to be associated with dwarfism and can therefore be reasonably inferred based on archaeozoological evidence. There are other disease factors to consider within the translocation framework. It is possible that animals being moved brought along pathogens and parasites which had the potential to affect the local people, wildlife, and livestock already present. One archaeological example of this is the human-aided movement of osteoporosis caused by avian leukosis virus in chickens. Alternatively, newly translocated species may encounter new pathogens and parasites upon introduction, and the population could suffer as a result. A good Saharan example of this, Trypanosoma evansi, commonly referred to as Sura, as a form of trypanosomiasis, which is endemic to sub-Saharan tsetse fly, but which was introduced into the horsefly population of North Africa via the blood of infected camels or other livestock. The health of the newly translocated animal would have been at risk for other reasons. Although domesticated species are ostensibly well cared for by their human keepers, the combination of atypical movement and a new environment causes significant amounts of stress and can potentially increase mortality rates. People move animals in the past for many reasons. Albarella suggests that people moving to new lands bring with them elements of the world that they are about to leave, and specifically refers to live animals. So again, they start in the Levant and migrate through Egypt, go westward and go south. You clearly see this trend, and they're bringing animals with them. And one of the reasons could be they're trying to bring animals that remind them, or anything that reminds them of home, right? It is probable that species were transported for other reasons, including economic gains or increased power and status on the part of the person moving or receiving the animal. It is also likely, especially with regard to the nature of animal movement across the Sahara, that species in the process of translocation pass through many sets of hands or were moved on the backs of several different camels throughout their journey. Translocated species, by definition, are introduced to areas outside their previous realms of experience. People meeting an animal that they have never encountered before are unlikely to have the same perception of that species as the person who raised or transported it to that location. In fact, unless substantial transfers of knowledge has preceded the arrival of a new species, the translocated animal may be viewed and managed in a totally different way. For example, the same chicken stock used for egg production in some parts of the Roman Empire might have been desirable for sacrifice or other purposes in different parts. And this is part right here. This part right here is integral for your understanding. It just lets you know that, you know, if you're in a different area that has a different need and a different purpose for the animal, for like chickens in Southwest Asia and East Asia has always been used for fighting, right? And then later on, we see it first being eaten in Palestine. That's when the first evidence of consumption of chickens is in Palestine. So these two different cultures have different uses for the same animal, and that's what he's explaining here. It says, even if a domestic animal successfully accompanied people migrating to a new area, other factors such as climate could well have affected the methods used to establish and manage it. New strategies might have been developed in response to differences between the area from which the animal was originally taken and the region to which it is translocated. For example, seasonal movement during only the winter or spring, or species-specific housing. Key domestic species. A diverse range of fauna was transported across North and West Africa by various methods and at different times. Here we focus on the key domestic taxa chickens. We also discussed the guinea fowl and francolins, dogs, equids, pigs, camels, dromedaries, caprines, sheep and goats, and cattle unhumped and humped. We review that biological needs and requirements of each taxon or group, probable methods of transportation and movement, the earliest archaeological evidence for their arrival or adoption, and factors that would have affected approaches to their management and husbandry. When possible, we also contextualize taxa with regard to both environments and the peoples who kept them. Because again, in order to have animals, domesticated animals, you need people with that know-how, right? Where are these people coming from at the onset? The Levant. That's where it starts. It starts about 1000 BC. The same period where we see a lot of Eurasian markers going into northern East Africa anyway. It makes sense. You see T coming down. You see J coming down. You see these different markers that's coming down and penetrating. And it could, several reasons could be the reason why that's happening. It could be because the Bronze Age collapse. It could be because the Assyrians, you know, is forcing a lot of people to flee that area and sweep down low into Egypt and going through the Syro-Phoenician rift. There's a lot of reasons we can draw up and, you know, to explain the movement of different Eurasian groups during that time. And we see it in the peoples of East Africa and the Horn of Africa. We can see that there was a Eurasian pulse event during that time. Right. And we see it within the Bantu. We see a Bronze Age element being spread together with the Bantu agricultural expansion. Right. And even earlier than that, we see a Neolithic Levantine component coming in. It all makes sense. It comes together and culminates to paint this beautiful picture of a migratory event, a multiple migratory event emanating from the Levant, coming into Africa, sweeping through North Africa, then going south. All right. Why do you think you see T1 amongst the Daza people? We talked about that the other day. You know, all of this is working harmoniously together to paint the same narrative of migration. Right. And as we read in the paper yesterday, the sub-Saharan people are not isolates. They're not isolated people at all. All right. If you want to go Paleolithic times, we can give you papers showing that there's evidence that sub-Saharan elements have been traveling since that time, the Holocene time, Bronze Age, Neolithic, what have you. We can show that, right? And it fits well with domesticated animals coming in and migrating first from the Levant into Egypt through North Africa and then southwards. Anyway, chickens and guinea fowl. And what's interesting about the guinea fowl is the guinea fowl actually shows evidence that not only that we travel from the north down south, when we got there, we traveled back up north to trade the guinea fowl. All right. Yep. So anyway, it says in comparison with a mammal or similar size, chickens require a little water. For the purpose of comparison, a rabbit, a similarly sized mammal, requires 90 milliliters per kilogram. If allowed to forage freely and presented with a rich environment and or kitchen scraps, chickens can support themselves almost entirely. Water intake is vital for egg-laying hens, and if prevented from drinking, laying hens can take days to resume normal activity. Provisions of water would therefore have been key to egg-laying success in the past. Susceptibility to dehydration and predation would have been substantial practical risks of chicken translocation. However, in terms of moving alone, chickens are quite portable. Due to behavioral differences, it is unlikely that chickens could be safely herded across large distances like other galliforms, as their tendency to flight will require some form of restraint. It is probable that another method of transport would have been used. There are some issues with the identification of chicken from archaeological assemblages. First, small taxa, especially avians, are underrepresented to assemblages which are not sieved through fine mesh. Additionally, avian bones have thinner walls and are more easily destroyed than those of mammals. Although bird elements are morphologically distinct from mammal elements, avian identification can present substantial difficulty to the non-specialist, and bird bones sometimes go completely unidentified. Importantly, an enormous challenge is presented by the process of distinguishing domestic chicken elements from those of other galliform birds, more specifically guinea fowl, and members of the Francolin genera. Especially in sub-Saharan Africa, it is unclear from many older reports if the only bird elements recovered from a site were clearly identified as chickens to the exclusion of other galliform birds in the same size range. There is no literary record of Francolin translocation, but guinea fowls were likely to have been traded northward into Europe as a rare exotic domesticate, as they are described in recognizable detail as an African bird by Roman authors from the 1st century BC, including Varro. This is what I'm talking about. So the guinea fowl shows that when we were in the south, we were trading northwards as well, because we're bringing sub-Saharan African species of galliform to the north, and it's making its way to Europe. And as we know in the paper we read this week, that the West Africans also have a component that date back to 2,000 years, which you can marry that with the Roman trade, right? It says the guinea fowl is referred to in other sources from Italy and Greece, but the geographic origin of the guinea fowl, which was moving to Europe, is not currently known. There's little evidence of the guinea fowl population becoming established in Europe in the Roman period. It would seem that either the husbandry methods used to keep the birds did not travel with them, or they were initially unsuccessful in the new environment. It is worth noting here that domestication status of the Numidia has been debated, at least for areas within the natural range. Based upon environmental interactions and behavior, Blanche concludes that it is only partly domesticated, while MacDonald refers to it as a certain African domesticate in the same volume. While they admit the guinea fowl is quite behaviorally difficult, Gifford Gonzalez and Hanot describe it as a domesticated species. At any rate, since the birds were translocated to Europe by the 1st century BC, a close relationship of some kind with people is clear. Again, you can't have domesticated animals without having people domesticated. It's just easy, basic, simple stuff, right? Consideration for domestication as a co-evolutionary process rather than a singular event after which immense physiological and behavioral changes are clearly evident might be productive framework for future research and debates on the status and role of the guinea fowl. The earliest chicken bones in North Africa were excavated from the Phoenician colony of Mogador on the Atlantic coast of Morocco and were dated to the 7th century BC. So the people that's probably responsible for the introgression of the chicken into Africa and then later on sub-Saharan Africa, it's most likely the Phoenicians and other Near Eastern people, right? It says, although it is possible that Later construction at the site could have disturbed some context. This date is consistent with the movement of chickens along the Mediterranean coastline. The first depictions of chickens in North Africa are 25 small bronze figurines, which were received from Saharan at the sanctuary of Demeter in Persephone. These were dated to the 6th century BC on a stylistic basis, and the chicken bones were identified in later components of the same site. Although no chickens were identified at Carthage before the 5th or 4th century BC, there is some as yet unpublished evidence for chickens at Carthage from the 6th century BC. Another coastal site, Sidi Kabresh, had chickens' bones present from the 2nd century BC, prior to the end of the 1st millennium BC. Chicken elements were only present at sites along the coast, which probably reflects a bias towards excavating Greek, Phoenician, and Punic colonies and a lack of interest in indigenous settlements. However, it is notable that no chickens were identified at the inland site of Alburos prior to the arrival of the Romans. By the 1st millennium AD, the majority of assemblages across North Africa have chickens present, regardless of location. Sites such as Fouet and Kekra in Central Sahara have no chicken elements present in assemblages from the 1st millennium BC. Yet perhaps as a result of increased Garamantian trade, chickens turn up in context from the 2nd century AD onward at Jarma, capital of the Garamantes. These general trends may indicate rather swift adoption of species across North Africa. In West Africa, chickens have been identified at Arundo around 428 to 635 AD in the Faline Valley of Upper Senegal region. In Burkina Faso, the Keri Congo has elements which are likely to be chicken dating from the 1st and 5th centuries AD, and definitely identify elements dated to AD 560 to 660. And a 1.8 meter diameter feature overlaid with large shards and with shallow post holes was tentatively classed as chicken coop at the site of Huluf, South Lake Chad, 660 to 775 AD. So again, you start seeing these things earlier in the north and then making their way down to the south. And we see that with the same thing with the empires, because we're dealing with the empires right now, Ghana and Mali. Shanghai, all these things are CE Common Era medieval empires. Where were these people before that? They were harboring in the north, trading in the north. All right. It says, although no avian remains from the site were speciated, in the subsequent centuries, the chicken appears to have been adopted at large populations of communities throughout arid West Africa. This is unsurprising given that chickens can be raised in small spaces in marginal environments as long as they are managed with care and kept safe from predators. Chickens produce multiple highly useful products in addition to their flesh, including eggs, dung, and feathers. They have also been valued for their roles in divination and entertainment. With regard to the spread of chickens to sub-Saharan West Africa, a trans-Saharan route as well as an east to west route across the Sahel has been suggested, and it's possible that multiple introductions happened. Linguists have also argued for an earlier presence of chicken in West Africa than the animal bone evidence can currently support. All right, let's move on. It says here, dogs were present in North Africa in the Sahara by the 6th millennium BC. It is assumed they spread together with domesticated cattle and caprines as herding animals. The presence of cut and burn marks on dog bones from the late Bronze Age and Iron Age levels out Burros, Tunisia, suggests that they were occasionally eaten. However, in Saharan rock art, dogs are mainly depicted in hunting scenes. Dogs reached sub-Saharan West Africa at about the same times as cattle and caprines. For the first half of the 2nd millennium AD, there's evidence that dogs were eaten, and this has been connected to similar practices among Berbers in Northern Africa. Recent research suggests that movements of dogs south of the Sahara may have been challenged by the presence of canine-specific pathogens, in addition to those which affect a range of species. Apart from the risk presented by disease in southern regions, and dispersal of dogs throughout North and West Africa was probably less problematic than moving species such as pigs. All right, let's move on to horses. Equids, horses. The horse was and continues to be prominent and meaningful figure to the people of the Sahara. It may have been specifically associated with early oasis communities. This connection is evident in figurines and rock art. There are numerous depictions of horsemen and chariots in Wadi al-Ajal near Ghat. Mussolini estimates that these depictions are dated from 700 BC to 8500. Now, this makes sense if you know anything about the Noke culture, having an early horse culture, because how do Nokes get it? They have pictures and depictions of them riding on things that look like horses, right? So having an early introduction of horses here could be the thing. Could explain that. It says paintings and engravings of horses are also present from Saharan Mauritania near Dar to Chad, all the way north to Morocco and east to Chad. Horses have historically been viewed as a prestige animals in many cultures, and Sahara was no exception. They may have been favored for riding and display due to this association. High-ranking Garamantes of Fazan were described as using chariots drawn by 4 horses in the 5th century BC. And Strabo stated that horse breeding was an activity avidly pursued by the Saharan peoples. This might indicate the incipient development of Saharan horse breeds by the end of the 1st millennium BC and suggests the existence of specialized oasis husbandry methods. Estimates for the water requirements of horses vary widely, but range from 30 to 90 liters a day, depending upon the ambient temperature, what the horse is eating, and whether or not it is lactating. Horses can pack approximately a third of their weight. A North African horse of relatively small stature could probably carry about 90 kilograms. And in the 19th century, an average horse could be purchased for 10 or 20 slaves. An excellent horse might be worth 100 camels. Despite the fact that local conditions pose challenges to routine horse maintenance and care, horses in present-day West Africa are kept as a marker of prestige and mode of transport by wealthy individuals. Humidity-related diseases in Western Africa have a serious effect on horse mortality. Law has described how the overall health of horses progressively decrease from north to south. Horses are also vulnerable to heat exposure, which can limit their use to cooler hours of the day. Some pony breeds, however, have become tripano tolerant and generally better adapted to the West African climate and conditions. There were firm links between horse ownership, social political power, high status, and pre-colonial Islamic societies of West Africa. Furthermore, due to the association of horses with raids and warfare, the symbolic worth of horse increased over time. Because the endemic diseases of West Africa that limited successful horse breeding, horses continued to be imported from the north. These transactions contributed to the formation of large-scale, long-distance trade in the pre-colonial era. The combination of husbandry, environmental requirements, and disease vulnerability probably proved challenging for those moving horses in the past. Identification of horse material for archaeological context and differentiation of their elements from those of donkeys, mules, and hinds can present considerable difficulty. Depending upon the degree of fragmentation present in the assemblage and other issues, it seems most likely that the horse arrived in Egypt at some point in the early 2nd millennium BC, which coincides neatly with the dates of diffusion for chariot technology. Rock art depictions of chariots and horses are present across the Sahara, and a distal equid femur fragment, considered too large to be a domestic donkey, was recovered near a human rib cage in the Antana tomb. And Wadi Tansuf, dated to 1000 BC. So again, there's evidence here of a horse dated to 1000 BC in the Sahara. So you can argue an early introduction of horses, right? Which would explain why the Note culture would have horses too. It says, based on size alone, this fragment could potentially have originated from either a horse or a wild ass. The earliest definitively identified horse bones in North Africa are associated with Arthur Burrows and date to the 8th century BC. Maghrebian coastal cities also have early horse remains. The Phoenician Punic site of Mogador in Morocco and Carthage in Tunisia. Considering the fact that domesticated horse material has been identified at sites from the 4th and 3rd millennium BC in the Levant, and Egypt has horse bones from the 2nd millennium BC, it seems possible that the earliest horse in the Maghreb may have been introduced prior to the arrival of Phoenicians in the 9th century BC. The earliest identifiable horse material to West Africa comes from the site of Akumbu. Skeletal evidence from the 1st millennium AD also includes 5 burials which were excavated from Dugji in northern Cameroon. 2 scholars have independently suggested that a small horse, perhaps the progenitor of the present-day local pony types, was extant in West Africa from the 1st millennium BC to the 1st millennium AD. Again, 3,000 years ago is a very integral point in West African history, right? This possibility is supported by linguistic evidence and perhaps also the tire panel tolerance and other environmentally specific adaptations of local modern ponies. Additionally, medieval Arabic source material describes the presence of very small horses in multiple regions of West Africa. This suggests that such animals were introduced prior to Arab contact. Finally, equestrian equipment, which technologically predates the set of paraphernalia used by Arab peoples, for example, a bridle with bit, a saddle with stirrups, is known from some regions of West Africa. So there is evidence of early horse domestication in West Africa. Again, we have the Note depictions pointing us in that direction. All right. Equids, donkeys, mules, and hindies. Donkeys are well adapted to hot and arid climes, and Libyan donkeys were considered to be second only to the camel in terms of their hardiness and desert adaptation. In terms of water consumption, donkeys can survive for 1 or 2 days with very little water, but a working donkey requires about 10 liters a day. Donkeys can carry about 65 kilograms and were no doubt a great benefit to the past communities who adopted them. Apart from their vital roles as general pack animal and operating wells and mills, Marshall has noted their importance in bringing water to other types of livestock in arid environments across North and East Africa during the modern era. Mules and hindies, the offspring of a female donkey and a stallion, or a male donkey and a mar respectively, present an ideal compromise between the characteristics of each species. More resilient than a horse and capable of carrying approximately 70 to 90 kilograms. However, the infertility of mules and hindies present a considerable drawback. Considering the hardiness of donkeys, mules, and hindies, human-aided movement of these animals may have been comparatively less difficult than moving species with more stringent environmental or husbandry needs, for example, pigs and horses. The Equus africanus, the wild ass, is native to North Africa and found at Holocene sites across Maghreb and Sahara. The conventional narrative suggests that wild donkeys were domesticated in Egypt around 4000 BC. But given the occasional rock art portrayals across Sahara and abundant population of the Equus africanus, it may well be that the Saharan donkeys were independently domesticated. Although further research is necessary to investigate this possibility, debates regarding donkey domestication continue, but ancient DNA research supports the idea of the donkey as an African domestic. Some results have hinted at a strong affiliation between domestic donkeys and the Nubian and Somali clades of wild donkeys. An equid mandible and teeth were excavated from the Middle Pastoral Crabelle, 4044 to 3960 BC, in the northern part of Masak Setafet. All other faunal remains from this site were identified as domesticated cattle or caprine. This may be an indicator that the specimen represents a domestic donkey, and the date of the find is consistent with pre-dynastic and early dynastic donkey finds in Egypt. The existence of a desert caravan route for donkeys during the late Old Kingdom period, first intermediate period, and between the Oxyrhynchus and the Bahariya in the Ptolemaic period, both in Egyptian Western desert, shows that it was possible to use the animals for desert transport to some extent. Outside the Nilotic region, the first securely dated Equus asianus originates from the context dated to 2197 to 1435 BC at the site of Wadi Harik in western Sudan. By this point, it is possible that domestic donkeys were present in the Sahara and the Maghreb, but lack of excavated sites from that period hampers any such interpretation. Many rock art depictions of people riding equids are found throughout the Garamanti heartlands and in the Libyan Sahara. Equid remains were recovered from the first millennium BC context at Zenkerkara, an early Garamantian hill fort in Sahara. These are small in size, indistinct in morphology, and are thought to probably be donkey. However, another site in the same region, Fouet, has no equid bones, though the sample concern is rather small. The earliest identified equid, tentatively identified as Equus asianus in sub-Saharan West Africa, was excavated at Sior in the Middle Synagogue Valley and is dated to AD 1 through 250. A single donkey element dated to the first millennium BC is reportedly present in Walati, also in the Middle Synagogue Valley. As few details of the faunal assemblage have been published, this designation should probably be regarded with some caution. Some of the early settlement assemblages from the Maghrebian sites, such as Alboros, Carthage, and Mogador, have equids present, and although it is often impossible to differentiate between the skeletal remains of horses, mules, and hinds or donkeys, the first and last species were certainly present and widespread by the mid-first millennium BC. Mules and hinds have not been definitively identified as assemblages from the areas considered here, but the difficulty presented by their identification makes this unsurprising. In sub-Saharan Africa, donkeys and horses become ubiquitous in the later first millennium AD. Hopefully, future excavations and analysis will help to clarify the appearance and movement of equids across these regions. Pigs. Pigs present a particular challenge in terms of movement, and special skills were probably required to transport them. Apart from the logistical problems of moving pigs, there are other issues of serious concern. As a species, pigs are ill-suited for hot environments. They sunburn easily, do not have sweat glands, and lack an effective mechanism to keep cool in high temperatures. Ample shade and water is required in order to avoid high death rates from heat stress. Hold on, sorry, I lost my place. Right here. Of all species discussed here, pigs would probably have benefited the most from being moved at coolest parts of the year. Adult pigs may have been impossible to move long distance across the high temperature areas of the Sahara Desert. Pigs farrow in the autumn, and with a gestation period of roughly 115 days, followed by a 4 to 8 week weaning period, piglets may have been light enough. Modern piglet weighs around 7 to 21.3 kilograms, depending upon the age of which they are weaned, for transport by pack animals in the spring months. Of all the species discussed here, pigs may have been the most difficult to transport and manage due to probable necessity of packing them onto another animal. The rapid maturation and the environmental requirements, pigs were present in Egypt from the 5th millennium BC and have been identified in Fezzan in the phase 8 levels of Jarma, 150 BC to AD 50. In every subsequent phase up to the early modern period, a single swift cranial fragment came from a period 2 layer at Zinkekra. And although this has not been directly dated, it is considered part of the early Garmontian phase, which is 1000 to 500 BC. Most evidence points towards a European introduction of domestic pig in West Africa, although bone finds at one early Iron Age site in South Africa suggest that the animal may have already been propagated over the African continent by around AD 600. Pigs are generally not kept by nomadic pastoralists, and therefore they probably did not spread across the Sahara from North Africa together with the domestic cattle and caprines. Linguists have argued for a pre-European introduction and proposed that domestic pigs may have been taken from northeastern Africa down the Nile, spreading further overland to west central Africa along the corridor from Darfur to Lake Chad and reaching central Nigeria in medieval times. However, there are no archaeological bone remains to support this hypothesis. So, the diet or whatever in the forms of ancient sub-Saharan Africa would have not consisted of pigs. There's no evidence for it. It says here, camels. Due to their tolerance for heat and ability to withstand water shortages, camels have a reputation for being ideally suited to the environmental extremes of North Africa and are typically kept in areas which have less than 250 millimeters of annual rainfall. Camels are able to conserve moisture very effectively, can sustain a fluid loss of roughly 30% of their body weight, and are able to rehydrate safely and quickly. In high temperatures, camels can go without water for 3 to 5 days and for up to 6 to 7 days in cool conditions. In addition, they are able to mediate the effects of extreme temperatures and regulate their body temperatures more efficiently than other animals. They also possess other adaptive advantages, including bushy eyelashes, which prevent wind-blown sand and dust from entering their eyes, and feet with cutaneous pads, which allow them to move with relative ease over difficult terrain. Camels can carry up to 150 to 200 kilograms and are potentially sources of milk and meat if necessary. They are popularly thought of as desert pack animals par excellence and frequently contrasted with horses in terms of their slowest land speed. but a direct comparison between these two species is not viable. Between the social and symbolic differences in how people perceive camels and horses, they have adapted to very different environments and are not suitable for the same types of terrain. Speed is also not only a factor worth considering. Calculations involving water weight and horse carrying capacity reveal that horses require more water than they can physically carry during heavy activity, which is less of an issue for camels. Conversely, rocky terrain is very difficult for camels and can cause lameness. Camels are also vulnerable to flyborne diseases, which are so prevalent throughout the northern Maghreb and parts of West Africa. The variation in vegetation environment across the Sahara and rest of the Maghreb has led to camels becoming highly adapted to specific regions, as it is likely that camel deaths would be unsustainably high if one type of camel was taken directly across the Sahara. The 19th century caravan practice was to change camel teams entirely at different points along the route. If this tradition originated in earlier practices, it may suggest that distinct breeds of camels were developed for regional trade purposes and then linked up together across wider stretches of landscapes. The earliest identified camel skeletal material in North Africa outside of Egypt has been excavated from Carthage in Tunisia and dated to the 5th to 3rd centuries BC. Camel has also been identified in Utica from the 1st millennium BC context. About a quarter of coastal sites in Maghreb from the 2nd century BC to the 7th century AD had camels present, but the species is typically only represented by a handful of bones. Since the climate of the northern Tunisian and Moroccan sites in particular is unsuitable for camels, the animals at these sites were probably used in transport. The camel arrived in the Sahara by the 1st millennium AD. The first camel bones from a Saharan context date to no later than the 2nd century AD and were recovered from sites of Agram, Nagharif, and Jarma and the Garmatian capital. Later remains from the Saniyat Jibril date from the 1st to the 4th century AD. The proportion of camels appears to have increased over time at these sites, which might hint at their rapid adoption. However, the sample sizes are very small and reconstruction changes the structure of the camel population with any confidence is not possible. It is possible that the camels were being raised outside the oasis settlements as no unfused juvenile bones were noted at Jarma. This is consistent with the management requirements and foraging tendencies of camels, which could have been quite destructive within the oasis settlement. The earliest dated, definitively identified camel remains in sub-Saharan Africa were excavated in Senegal from the site of Kubalel, AD 250 to 400. This may indicate the use of camels in trans-Saharan trade by the early 1st millennium AD. However, possible camel remains were reported from Waladi along the middle Senegal, dating 800 to 30 BC. If the dating and speciation were confirmed, it would dramatically change the current narrative about the introduction of the camel to West Africa. Linguistic evidence supports a northern route of introduction for species into West Africa. Nevertheless, an east to west introduction through the Savannah corridor is argued for by some. Dromedaries cannot thrive south of the Sahel zone because of their vulnerability to endemic diseases in the region. But it's possible that certain regional varieties used in trade were marginally more successful. At least the species enjoyed a form of iconographic success in the southern Lake Chad region of the Sahel, as is indicated by the presence of a camel figurine at the site of Halouf, dating 1400, 1600 Common Era. All right, caprines, sheep and goats. Caprines were spread over land from the Levant to Africa, passing first through Egypt. So again, as we've been stressing throughout this video, in order to have domesticated animals, you have to have people from the region from which those animals come from that are familiar with the skills and the know-how to breed them, right? You have to do that, and they have to translocate them. So they're coming from the Levant. These are people coming from the Levant. This explains the Eurasian components and elements that we see in northern and western Africans. It says here, the earliest evidence of domesticated sheep and goats date back to the late 7th millennium BC, and several sites across the Egyptian desert are known for the 5th millennium BC caprine material. Although bone evidence is usually very limited, by the mid-5th millennium BC, caprines were probably introduced into the Sahara. Coastal northern Africa may, as part of the Mediterranean zone, have seen the arrival of the earliest domesticated animals and agricultural economies through several waves of seafaring. Caprines reached sub-Saharan West Africa in the late 3rd millennium BC, late Stone Age. Size analysis suggests that new types of sheep goat appeared in West Africa after the late Stone Age, mid-1st millennium BC, early 1st millennium AD, Iron Age. This may have involved new introductions that were associated with documented renewal of population movement. Mid-1st BC, this may have evolved with population movement. So we're getting people that are familiar with these type of sheep and goats that come from the Levant, moving into these areas through different epochs of time. It says, but could also represent locally developed breeds. In the arid environments of Africa, sheep and goats are probably the most easily kept of larger domesticated food animals. Sheep are grazers and may compare with cattle for the same type of pasture, while goats are browsers and can subsist on a more varied diet. Varied diet. I don't know how I messed it up. Varied diet. In general, caprines and especially sheep need to drink more often than cattle, but their intake is smaller, and they can therefore be sustained by more limited sources that would not support cattle. This factor, combined with their comparatively rapid terrestrial movement speed, probably made caprines, especially goats, less challenging to translocate than other species. Cattle. The oldest uncontroversial African cattle remains were found in the Egyptian Western Desert and date to the 5th millennium BC. Cattle thus appeared about simultaneously with the domesticated caprines and were quickly spread to the Sahara, reaching West Africa in the 3rd millennium BC as well. As we suggested for caprines, it is also possible that the new cattle types were introduced during the subsequent Iron Age. The available evidence points to the introduction of humped cattle, zebu, from Asia by the way of the Arabian Sea, entering the Horn during the 1st millennium AD, spreading rapidly over Africa from there. Osteologically, zebu cattle are difficult to differentiate from unhumped cattle, and crossbred types are also existed. Cattle are ecologically demanding animals, which need more drinking water and better pasture than sheep or goats, but their characteristics and requirements vary according to their type. Pastoral nomads keep mainly humped cattle, although pure types do not occur in Africa. African cattle all have humpless origins, but with zebu introgression decreasing in the north to south and east to west direction, zebu need less food and water and are better suited to long-distance migration than humpless cattle. Moreover, their milk production is less affected by food shortages, and they are less sensitive to ticks, gastrointestinal parasites, and rinderpests. Taurines are mainly kept in transhumant systems or by sedentary farmers and are more resistant to the trypanosomiasis. Sanga cattle, usually humpless, but sometimes with a small muscular hump, are sometimes considered a 3rd type of African cattle. Some authors consider the Sanga to be the descendants of locally domesticated African aurochs, while others argue that they are the result of crossbreeding taurine and zebu cattle. They are less resistant to rinderpests and produce less milk than zebu, but they are trypanotolerant. At the end of the 19th century AD, a rinderpest epidemic eradicated taurine and Sanga cattle from most of the African continent. Cattle often have high symbolic value, especially in pastoral nomadic cultures, an importance to which their numerous appearances in Saharan rock art also testify. However, it appears that in economic terms or with regard to the numbers of bones in the archaeological assemblages, caprines are usually more important. In any case, it is likely that a mixed herds consisting of both cattle and caprines were kept in order to moderate and reduce risk, maintain good pasture, make maximum use of available resources, and to better spread yield throughout the year. Data and discussion. The geographical distribution of sites with published faunal assemblages, many of which have been referenced in text and some of which have been incorporated into graphs, is shown in Figure 5.1. This map illustrates the staggering spatial scope of our chapter and reflects the traditional research bias towards colonial sites on the Mediterranean coast and other favored regions. And I showed this map earlier when we were reading at the onset of the chapter. It shows a map where there's a lot of West African regions, Sahelian regions, North African regions, where we see these animal domestics at. It says Figure 5.2.7 shows aspects of faunal data collated from phase assemblages from different regions across North Africa, West Africa, and the Sahara. And each graph is proportional to each axis, each species on the y-axis is plotted over time to the x-axis. The lines across each graph, trend lines, are rolling averages of the proportion of each species points against the total number of cattle, caprine, and pig elements. At these three species were consistently reported across the regions. The rolling average, also called a moving mean, trend lines show the mean average proportion of the indicated species over a 250-year period. Each point on the graph represents a temporal midpoint of a single phase assemblage to illustrate the complexity of variation of funnel data. So I'll just go over this real quickly. So the chickens, they have the chickens having their earliest date here around 500 BC. I know that's very, very small for you guys, but I'll try to work with you. They come in about 500 BC, and they spike around the Common Era 400. Horses, they come in around 900 BC. And let me see if I can blow this up a little bit when I'm distorting it. Yes, it's going to want to distort it. Let me see if I can go back to it. Hold on. Yeah, I wish they had like some kind of website link I can click and show you guys this thing in large. But there's three different colors that represent the Western Maghreb, Eastern Maghreb, and I barely can read the third one. But basically, this chart tells you different color lines as different portions of Africa or the Maghreb, and when there's introduced into those regions and their frequency. So the high lines or the spikes are when you get the most of that certain animal or certain breed, right? I'm going to skip that because I can barely read that for you guys. Well, anyway, you can see when they were introduced. And we already read when they introduced, right? So table 5.1, faunal data organized by the region and time periods. So here, Algeria, site of project, the data span, 200 BC, yada, yada, yada. We'll probably skip over that too and just read the rest of this. See Lake Chad, 1900 BC in Lake Chad for some animals. Let's go on. The Niger Men, 1700 BC to 500 BC, 800 BC to 1700 AD, so on and so forth. All right, let's get to the conclusion. All right. It says here, figure 5.2 to 5.5. Use three regions due to the low overall numbers of chickens, equids, and camels, as well as in their absence of pigs in the Niger River and Lake Chad assemblages. However, we were able to develop more nuanced graphs for the caprines and cattle. Figures 5.6 and 5.7 present the greater study area is divided into 5 geographic regions: Saharan, Tunisia, Tripolitania in the Sahara, Mauritania, sites in Western Maghreb, the Niger River, predominantly sites in Mali and Burkina Faso, and Lake Chad, sites mainly south of Lake Chad, including northern Nigeria and Cameroon. As previously noted, there are some inherent biases in the data, including the preponderance of late Roman and Byzantine material in Saharan, Tunisia, with a clearly observable spatial and functional distribution of only a few inland royal sites. Assemblages originated from Carthage alone. This particular bias affects Tripolitania, Sahara, and Mauritania, as well to some extent the Niger River and Lake Chad assemblages are somewhat more widely dispersed, but spatial biases are evident in all regions. No graph is included for dogs because although the species was an important component of pastoral animal husbandry and was eaten by some Saharan peoples, they often occur as associated bone groups, especially in periods which dominate this data set. This can skew the relative proportion of other species which tend not to be encountered by ABGs. The material from the Carthage Circus excavations has not been included in the equipped graph for the same reason. Despite these exclusions and issues, a number of patterns are clear and merit discussion. There are unsurprisingly strong differences between regions with regard to relative species proportions, and even when considering only the temporal data, the data are not evenly distributed across space and time due to excavation biases and other factors. However, the relative frequency of caprines increased over time in all regions rather than keeping with King's paper. Conversely, the relative frequency of cattle decreases over time, especially after the 1st century BC. Although this is by no means evenly distributed development, it is possible that these two trends, a general increase in caprines and concomitant decrease in cattle may be linked to changes in landscape and climate that encourage raising more drought-tolerant livestock in some regions. Pigs are another matter altogether. They initially turn up in comparatively high percentages in Saharan Tunisia, and their relative frequency wavers over time. Domestic pigs are present at Jarma and the Sahara and Tripotania sites, but are missing from the Niger River and Lake Chad assemblages. So when you go to sub-Saharan Africa, there's really no pigs there. It says here, it is possible that some specimens typically identified as warthog or another swid may be Zoostropha domestica, but were clearly of importance from at least a medieval period. In North Africa, pigs are an important part of urban assemblages from the mid-first millennium AD, but are only infrequently identified after 8600, which broadly coincides with the adoption of Islam across the religion. One possibility of the introduction of pigs and their husbandry to parts of northern Africa is their inclusion in a package of agricultural skills and techniques specific to oasis environments, which was disseminated across the Sahara, perhaps into other areas. The point at which pigs entered a prolonged period of increased frequency in the Tunisian and Tripotanian Saharan assemblages, AD 400-450, is also the point at which the chicken is most frequent, perhaps a reflection of urban animal husbandry regimes at large coastal sites in which both chicken and pigs would have flourished. However, skeletal evidence for pigs predates the occurrence of chicken remains at all sites. Chickens are vanishingly rare at some West African sites, which is likely to be accounted for by the use of single identification category for all avians. In some reports, equids and camels both appear more frequently in assemblages dating to the first millennium AD, particularly in North Africa and the Sahara. This might be a reflection of the use of some of these animals in pre-Islamic trans-Saharan trade. Archaeological visibility of these species may also have been impacted by diachronic changes in culinary practices and disposal of carcasses outside of habitation areas. It is worth noting here that in reviewing the collated data, certain sites appear to group more closely with husbandry practices prevalent in other regions. Agram Nat Harif, located swirly in the Sahara, has a high proportion of cattle. Gayo has a very high proportion of caprines and camels. Remains are present, which may be a reflection of its prominent role in the trans-Saharan trade. Concluding remarks. Many aspects of the process involved in moving animal species in the past remain conjectural. Although tantalizing possibilities exist for packages of species and skills, mechanisms for transporting certain animals, and the applicability of translocation as a way of approaching some of these matters, some evidence for the development of animal breeds which are more suitable for specific environments or regions through trypanotolerance or highly localized adaptations presents an enticing avenue for further research. Various biases in knowledge frustrate attempts at large-scale interpretation and have already been mentioned, but substantial gaps remain. We know little regarding the movement and introduction of domesticated species between the late Stone Age, when the earliest domesticates arrived, and the introduction made by Arab peoples or during the Islamic period. Perhaps horses and new types of cattle and caprines made it through the Sahara to West Africa in this period. What period? Between the late Stone Age and the time of the Arabs. Again, you got the note culture. They got horses, and then we have the horse femur that dates back to 3000 BC. Very possible. It says some specific themes have emerged through this study, chief of which is number of practical obstacles that affect the movement of different species. There are significant environmental differences between Saharan and Sub-Saharan Africa, which will have impacted the movement. Establishments and management of domestic animal species across and between the regions. Chief among this is disease. Dogs, horses, camels, and some cattle are vulnerable to trypanosomiasis and other fly-borne diseases of humid regions. Other health-related concerns abound. Camels will become unwell if they do not have access to enough salt in the form of halophyte plants. Pigs are easily sunburned and have extremely low tolerance for heat. All species have water requirements in order to survive and be productive, and fulfilling these needs in the Sahara and parts of West Africa would have been a continuous challenge. We are in general agreement with Liberani regarding the species composition and nature of caravans across the Sahara, but I'm not entirely comfortable regarding the idea that the southern regions of North and West Africa had little impact with regard to the innovation overall. While it is clear that most domestic species were introduced mainly from the north and east, and that pre-existing husbandry and transport skills would have been necessary to accomplish the translocation, local methods, and invention For example, the construction of huts to prevent biting insects from assessing horses as found in Haluf. The developments of tripano-tolerant breeds of dwarf sheep and goats were critical to the management and success of said species. Again, you have to have people with the know-how and skill set to maintain these animals. Those are the people that are translocating them from the Levant and from the Northeast, and then eventually across the Sahara and then down south into sub-Saharan Africa, which mirrors the genetic contributions that we see in sub-Saharan Africa coming from Eurasia. It says, unfortunately, it is difficult to detect the extent to which more archaeological ephemeral innovations spread out of the Sahelian belt in West Africa. Various narratives and conjectures for north to south moving animals in North and West Africa exist, but the translocation of animals from the south to the north is another story. Although we do not know the geographic origin of the guinea fowl that were translocated to Europe and described by Roman authors, it is possible that these originated in West Africa and may have been moved northward across the Sahara. So it's possible that people in the south during that time, during the Roman times, were trading guinea fowl upwards or northwards, and that's how it ends up in Europe. So we got trade going south and then trade going northwards, right? It says, matter of fact, why is it not highlighted? Let me highlight this real quick. It says the south to north trade in hippopotamus and elephant ivory is particularly of note and probably worth investigating. One archaeological example is a catch of hippopotamus ivory that was excavated from the context dating to the 11th century AD in Guyana, which is Mali, which you're going to be reading about Mali tomorrow, a terminus for trans-Saharan trade. Giraffe elements were identified in the 2nd century AD and 5th to 9th century levels at Jarma. These elements may represent the skin of a giraffe, which included lower leg and foot bones rather than a complete live animal. In-depth investigation of the movement of animal parts and products thus has the potential to enhance our understanding of regional connections. Because as we can see, you see the south going to the north because you see giraffes and stuff like that making its way to Libya, right? Making its way there to the most northern region, the Mediterranean coast of Africa. So these people were not stuck. They were going up and down, as we can see. Other lines of investigation might prove to be particularly viable. The introduction of the Fagara technology to the Wadi al-Ajal in the late 1st millennium BC is roughly in line with the first appearance of pigs and plant species associated with oasis agriculture. This lends some support to the idea that if there was an oasis agriculture package, pigs may have been part of it, complemented it, or well suited to such circumstances. Ostrich eggshells was a valuable and widely traded item, which is present across the Sahara and North Africa at sites such as Jarma and Altaburos. Ostriches have been extinct from much of this area since at least the beginning of the 20th century, but ancient ostrich ranges, including Egypt, parts of the Sahara, North Africa, pre-desert, and southern Tunisia. The origin of the eggshell at these sites is therefore uncertain. The husbandry requirements, behavior, and archaeological and textual evidence for the movement of key species we have discussed in this chapter highlight the complexity and importance of these processes and the value of animal management knowledge to past people of the Sahara and surrounding regions. We hope to have illuminated some trans-Saharan and West African connections through the framework of animal translocation and create a platform upon which future research on the roles of animals and their management can be built. All right. That's the chapter, man. That's the chapter. And as you can see, this is what connects all these locations. Seeing the domesticated animals, where they come from. A lot of these animals come via the Levant through Egypt and then sweep across North Africa and then makes its way to sub-Saharan Africa, Western Central Africa. You need people with the know-how to domesticate these animals, have the skills to maintain those animals and translocate them. And in order for you to do that, you have to have people that are familiar with the breeds that come from those regions that originally had them. This explains and goes well with the genetic data that we see in Burkina Faso, we see with the Fulani, which we're going to deal with the Fulani paper sometime tomorrow, Monday. We'll be dealing with how they obtain their when and how they obtain their ability to digest sugars and milks as adults. We're going to be dealing with that. That all culminates together to show that this is a demography. This is a migratory event and pulses of people coming from northeast, coming from the Levantine corridor, and then making their way into Africa and peopling. All right. So again, let me show you the cover of the book. We ain't got no secret sources over here. Mobile Technologies in the Ancient Sahara and Beyond by C.N. Duckworth. All right, so I'm done here, man. New Hope. I try, bro. I try. Man. Real Ruger, I try. I try to grind, man. Try to get y'all as informed as possible. These other channels are just trying to indoctrinate you guys, and I'm trying to give you resources. Yeah, and I will be back tomorrow early. So expecting to be live tomorrow early. We will be dealing with the Mali Empire. Like I said, happy Black History Month. Yap Gang everywhere, you never there. Definitely it's going to be a hibachi tomorrow, man. We're going to finish that book, by the way. Y'all know how I am with books. I like finishing them. I finish my books. You know what I'm saying? Like I finished my hibachi. We out of here, bro. Yeah. 7 candlesticks up, and I've been telling you niggas, it ain't a debate. It's a stick up gang.
I done did some shit that you ain't never did. I done saw some shit that you ain't never seen. I done been some places you ain't never been. I done did some shit that you ain't never did. Saw some shit that you ain't never seen. Been some places you ain't never been. Sip, drink, you don't never lean. Boat nickel with a 30 clip, big Glock 9 with a red beam. I done been broke, I done had money, I done had shoot, I was another team. I done did some shit that you ain't never did. Saw some shit that you ain't never seen. Been some places you ain't never been. Sip, drink, you don't never lean. Boat nickel with a 30 clip, big Glock 9 with a red beam. I done been broke, I done had money, I done had shoot, I was another team. I done did some shit that you ain't never did. Saw some shit that you ain't saw before. Spurred a nigga in the job before. Took off running from the law before. I was selling OG by the dollar store. Used to get that Reggie from Hilario. That was middle school, like in 6th grade. I was cutting the Philly with a switchblade. I knew I was destined for a big play. I knew I was destined for a mixtape. I been kicking flavors since the talent show. Had a fully loaded automatic flow. What's a fully loaded automatic flow? When I spit the verses like a calico. Watch me spit the verse like a calico. Run and let your mama and your daddy know. 7 shots. I am something to run and tell about. They thought I was smoking airplane gas, cause I'm jumping fly in the helicopter. 800 for the Louis Shades up in North Park just to look smart. Money caller with the T-top on the lawn horse and the push start. I done did some shit that you ain't never did. Saw some shit that you ain't never seen. Been some places you ain't never been. Sip, drink, you don't never lean. 4 nickel with a 30 clip, big Glock 9 with a red beam. I done been broke, I done had money, I done had shoot, I was the other team. I done did some shit that you ain't never did. Saw some shit that you ain't never seen. Been some places you ain't never been. Sip, drink, you don't never lean. 4 nickel with a 30 clip, big Glock 9 with a red beam. I done been broke, I done had money, I done had shoot, I was the other team.
Fuck, nigga. No man, give it up, nigga. Shout it out, let it bust, hit him. Did it all for a check killer. I was broke, I was sick, digging licks in the brick with a stick. Have a split, serving nicks to a zip. Take a drill, 30 big boys in a big clip. Out of town, serving at the quick trip. Ain't no hoe, this fofo, gon' blow. My grind big, you a small joke. I'm still into that mud, that wet dirt, give a fuck. I did the most in these down streets, having news in these back streets. Ain't no nigga real like me. Hard time made a stiff G. Serving 80s just to eat. Mama called it cause the work cheap. Sucker niggas wanna murk me. Had to get it, had to go see. Let these niggas know it ain't peace. I'm a damn fool if you want this.
I done did some shit that you ain't never did. Saw some shit that you ain't never seen. Been some places you ain't never been. Sip, drink, you don't never lean. 4 nickel with a 30 clip, big Glock 9 with a red beam. I done been broke, I done had money, I done had shoot, I was the other team. I done did some shit that you ain't never did. Saw some shit that you ain't never seen. Been some places you ain't never been. Sip, drink, you don't never lean. 4 nickel with a 30 clip, big Glock 9 with a red beam. I done been broke, I done had money, I done